What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, we have been talking from time to time about our political system and whether, in fact, the politicians pick us before we pick them by virtue of gerrymandering and all the tricks, the way that votes are suppressed, the way that, districts are drawn, the way money limits are allowed to run rampant, therefore really changing the nature of speech because some people can speak more loudly because they have more money. So the whole process, and I know a lot of people get bored with the process. It's like, let me get in there and vote, or let me choose for myself.
Yeah, but we're not even getting good people. I mean, even the parties aren't giving us good people. And maybe that's on purpose. Maybe they don't want to give us good, and they lock everybody else out. I mean, they really make it, you have to jump through a lot of hoops in order to get on there. And if you don't have the money, you're not going to get hurt anyway. So,
one of the things that seemingly has occurred in certain places is the fact that the party label perhaps isn't quite as important as in the past. In our state, for example, we used to have a party lever. And so everybody just went in and pulled the party lever. What's that?
I think a lot of people miss that.
Well, I know they miss it, but it's too simple. And now they have to go and they have to circle in a little oval for everyone.
It's so hard. I know.
Well, I mean, you've got to think
torturous,
a little bit. Seriously, let me ask you, because there are a lot of people who put up yard signs today, and you really have no idea whether they're a Democrat or a Republican. They have their own brand, if you will.
Yeah, but I still think that the parties have, I mean, they control the process, whether you see it or not. They're controlling the whole process. They're controlling the candidates they're giving us. They control everything.
However, on the municipal level, we learned from the folks at FairVote.org in a previous podcast that I think about 70% of the elected officials in municipalities across America don't run as part of a party. They run as individuals. Now, in our state, that has not occurred, and therefore the party appellation is still an important part of their identity. But in general, the trend across America is to have a non-party affiliation on the municipal level.
Well, I think that's good. I think we gotta, if we can take the party out of it and just judge people for who they are, I think we would be a much better, decision to make.
Well, there's so many decisions that are being made. Are party conventions a good idea, where somebody, for example, in a state only appeals to 600 delegates, and then if they get enough of those delegates, then they can go on to a primary, and that primary involves those who got 15% of the delegates. Then there are some that have a runoff. So if you don't get 50% of the primary, then you have to have a runoff. I mean, there's so many different intricacies to our system. And of course, we're a system that's controlled state by state, not really on a federal level.
And it takes so long. That's the whole thing. It seems like we're always in a cycle for election cycle. I mean, no sooner does one end than we're talking about the next one coming or the next one here. I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's just crazy, I think.
Well, there is this organization, FairVote, and they are nonpartisan, nonprofit, and they advocate for a lot of electoral reforms that they hope will make our democracy work better for all of us. And one of the things that they've really been behind lately is this first ever instant runoff in a congressional election. And this just occurred with ranked choice voting in Maine. And Drew Penrose from the organization is going to tell us how that worked and the applicability of this whole approach in places far and wide across America. So we'll talk about that. And John, we're also going to give people a glimpse into 2020 and how many non-competitive elections we can expect and what 2020 looks like on the congressional scene. Even though we just completed 2018, FairVote is already looking ahead. And that's what we try to do here on America Trends.
No, you're right. And it's a shame how many elections run unopposed in this state alone. I don't know how it is nationwide, but I mean, it's really a sad situation.
Well, looking at the electoral process, no one better than FairVote.org, represented today again by Drew Penrose here on America Trend. With us on the line from FairVote.org is Drew Penrose. And Drew is counsel to the organization and knows a lot about what's going on in terms of different voting practices and the reforms that FairVote is attempting to implement around the country. And Drew, I've got to ask you, you must have been very happy. There was the piece by David Brooks in the New York Times that said, there's nothing in the Constitution that says there have to be only two parties. There's nothing in the Constitution about parties at all. There's not even anything in the Constitution mandating that each congressional district have only one member and be represented by one party. We could have a much fairer and better system with the passage of a law. And he's talking about multi-member districts and ranked choice voting. And you guys have been way behind those issues for a long time. Tell us how in practice, not only in theory, for example, ranked choice voting worked in Maine in the 2018 election.
Absolutely, yes. I was certainly very excited to see that piece. You know, it had the headline, "One Reform to Save America," and we've seen pieces like that come out in a few different publications, really kind of emphasizing how critical this moment is in our politics and how much ranked choice voting speaks to many of the problems that we're seeing today. So Maine did make history by being the first state to use ranked choice voting in its congressional general elections this year. Under ranked choice voting, everybody ranks their choices, and then if somebody has a majority just based on the first choices, they'll win. But if nobody has a majority, then you eliminate candidates. And if your favorite candidate is eliminated, then your vote instantly goes to your second choice if they were in last place. That way, we're able to identify a candidate with real majority support. That happened in one of Maine's congressional elections, so Congressional District 2, which was a really hotly contested district. It was one of the ones that folks were calling a bellwether for the country, and it had 4 candidates in it, a Democrat and a Republican, and then 2 independent candidates. And nobody had a majority in the first round, so they collected the ballot data, did the round-by-round count, and we were able to see the Democratic challenger, Jared Golden, come out with a majority after the full ranked choice voting count. So it seems to have gone very smoothly. We got the results much quicker than if Maine had decided to, say, hold an actual runoff election, which is the other way that states do this sort of thing. And voters were able to rank their choices. The independents were able to run without anybody, so far as I know, calling them spoilers or suggesting they get out of the race or shaming people who voted for them. People were able to honestly rank their choices, and we were able to get a fair result at the end of the day. So it's really a very positive story for ranked choice voting's first use in federal congressional elections.
And what were some of those who were critics of this expecting, if they were looking for the worst? What were they looking for?
It's funny, some of the critics, when you'll see pieces, if you look at the critical pieces that were published in Maine publications, for example, they act as if this has never been done before. Ranked choice voting was invented over 100 years ago and is used in now 16 cities have either used it or are planning on using it in their next election cycles, used in other countries. So we knew that there was no reason it shouldn't go smoothly. But what the critics will say is that this is a crazy experiment, that nobody knows what's going to happen, that it'll be chaotic. In fact, it's not so different from other ways of conducting elections. It's just a way of allowing more people to participate, more people to express their full preferences, making sure we have sort of a fair and more inclusive process to get us to a result.
And did anybody find it confusing, or is it quite simple to implement within the voting booth?
We don't have any evidence that there was any problems with confusion in this election. Voters did rank their choices. We're not seeing high rates of errors from overvotes. Say it was, again, well below 1%. It was something like 0.2%. That is what we see ordinarily around the country. Maine used ranked choice voting for its primary elections this past June. That's actually a great example because when Maine voted in its primary elections with ranked choice voting, it voted at the same time on whether it wanted to continue using ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting was actually on the ballot alongside the elections where they were ranking their choices. And it was no surprise to me under those circumstances that ranked choice voting passed easily. It got a solid majority, more than when it had been on the ballot before in 2016. And that's because when voters actually have the opportunity to use the system, they realize that it's straightforward, that ranking your choices is something Americans love doing. You can hardly turn on the TV without seeing a top 10 list somewhere. It's intuitive. We use it all the time, whether you're grocery shopping or whatever. It's just a natural way to make decisions. And so it makes sense to extend it to this really important decision of who is actually going to hold public office.
When we look at Georgia, where we thought they might need to have a runoff election, ultimately it did not come down to that. But what normally happens in states that do have the runoff, whereas they don't get the votes to equal 50 plus, therefore they go back in? What happens the second time generally? Are there fewer people participating? It's costly, I would imagine, because you have to get the apparatus all in place again. What are the implications of these runoffs that are not done the first time when you rank vote immediately?
Right. The record of that is very clear, and it's all the things that you just articulated. There is a massive drop-off in runoff election turnout typically. And it's not too surprising. There's election day, which gets all the media coverage and everything. Mississippi will be having a runoff for its Senate race. So we'll see right there what kind of turnout we get in the runoff, even in a very high salience election like that. But if you look, so Maine did ranked choice voting for its primary elections. A lot of states did primary runoff elections, attempting to get that same majority support for their primary nominees. And turnout was incredible, enough that there were candidates who actually won in the runoff with fewer votes than they had earned in the first round. So it's kind of almost kind of ironic to think that you'd say, oh, you didn't earn a majority of votes in this first round of elections, so we're going to hold a second one, and then you go on to win with even fewer. Ranked choice voting, that can never happen. So it allows you to get literally the same turnout, right? Essentially, the same pool of voters is being able to participate in every round of election as long as they rank their choices. And you don't have that added expense of needing to conduct another election, which I should mention is particularly difficult when you take into consideration that some voters are going to be voting from overseas. Deployed military voters, for instance, are going to have a really hard time returning a second ballot. In fact, since I brought up Mississippi, I should mention that Mississippi voters who are overseas actually had the opportunity to participate in the runoff election to avoid those costs by submitting a ranked ballot.
Oh,
so
really?
Mississippi actually uses ranked choice voting for its military and overseas voters. Yeah, it's one of 5 states that do that. It's a way for them to comply with the federal law that basically says you have to allow military and overseas voters to participate in runoff elections without the need to put, say, 6 weeks between the rounds of voting or something like that.
I'm really curious because the Washington Post, when they editorialized and they said, give ranked voting a shot, and they said among the benefits cited by communities that have gone to ranked choice voting, more positive campaigning by candidates who recognize the need to earn second and third choice backing of voters who support their rivals, a more engaged and informed electorate, and voters freed from having to weigh their preference against their calculation of who has a chance to win. Did all of those things occur, even with any polling after or exit results? Do you think during the course of the campaign it was a better campaign overall in terms of the issues and the way it was handled?
The evidence seems to suggest that. It's a little hard to say conclusively when you've only got essentially one data point. But fortunately, we have more than one data point on ranked choice voting generally. So, in fact, we did surveys with a polling organization of voters in a number of ranked choice voting communities in California and Minnesota, Massachusetts, and elsewhere, and compared them against similar cities that do not have ranked choice voting, and did find that voters find the campaigns to be more positive, more issue-focused, and so on. I've also talked with people who have won election under ranked choice voting, and they'll just talk about how good strategy under ranked choice voting is reaching out to more voters instead of targeting people who you think aren't likely to support your opponents. You target everyone, because if they're likely to support your opponents, you still want their second choices. So yes, we do see that in real-world elections. And I apologize, there's a second part to your question.
Oh, no, just whether these are just better campaigns and whether they bring more people in and involve more people. And if that's the case, I mean, are we going to see more of this as we go along, or even these multi-member districts that I know you talked about if there are certain population considerations in various states? Remind us of the reform that FairVote would like to see in that regard.
Absolutely. I would be frankly shocked if we didn't see more states moving to ranked choice voting after the kind of success that we saw in Maine. It's been a remarkably positive story. When it comes to the use of multi-winner ranked choice voting, the goal there is to not just have one candidate win with a majority of votes, but to actually have several candidates win, each representing their own smaller share of the vote. So you have multiple communities represented. For example, if you had an area that was, say, 60% Democratic and 40% Republican, if only one candidate were elected, even with ranked choice voting, it would be a Democrat, which is, that's majority support. But there's those 40% of voters that prefer Republicans. Their voices would essentially be sort of washed out. With multi-winner ranked choice voting, though, you could elect actually three candidates, and you'd elect one Democrat and probably one Republican, and probably a third candidate who was maybe also a Democrat, but maybe not totally, on the same, representing the same constituencies as that first Democrat, a greater diversity of voices. This has an incredible number of benefits. So much greater representation of minority voices is the obvious benefit. More accurate representation of the majority community is another benefit. So, Pew does this study every year where they ask voters various political questions and then identify where they fall on the sort of left to right political spectrum. And they consistently find, and it was true in 2018 as well, that a majority of voters have, or the largest group of voters, have a relatively even mix of liberal and conservative viewpoints. Those voters, though, really aren't being represented. With multi-winner ranked choice voting, you start teasing out, you start actually hearing the voices of people who don't get representation right now, and that would include a lot of those moderate voices. It also ends the practice of gerrymandering effectively, because without a single candidate winning in each district, it becomes much harder to waste votes. So it becomes much harder to pack voters into a single district, for example. If you pack a lot of, say, Democratic voters into one district, they'll just be able to elect more of the candidates in that district, rather than wasting their votes on a candidate who would have won anyway. And likewise, it's harder to split up, to crack up populations among multiple districts, because they'll still have the power to elect at least one. So it's a different way of thinking about voting and representation. But there is a history of doing it in the United States. The city of Cambridge does it for its city council today, and 24 cities have done it in the United States before.
So a lot of the reforms that you're looking for are already being implemented in towns, cities, municipalities across the country. So we'll see those perhaps moving to a statewide level at some point. And how many of them have an impact on the federal level is still, to be seen. But let me ask you, there was a piece in the Los Angeles Times, and it said, today many states refuse to let citizens with past felony convictions vote, which effectively disenfranchises millions of African Americans, while others adopt voter ID laws requiring driver's licenses or other photo IDs that blacks, Hispanics, the poor, and the young often lack. Many countries hold elections on weekends to make it easy to vote, but our election day is on Tuesday, when many low-paid workers are not given time off. Thanks to all these obstacles, the U.S. ranks 31st among 34 developed nations in voter turnout. Rather than blaming non-voters, that's what we should be angry about and what we need to change. What do you think about that? What are some of the other reforms that FairVote would like to see?
Yeah, those access reforms are absolutely very important. So FairVote has in the past worked with members of Congress to introduce a constitutional amendment ensuring the right to vote in the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution does prohibit violations of the right to vote on the basis of certain things, so on the basis of race, on the basis of sex, and so on. But there's no actual positive affirmative right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. That would help go a long way towards setting the tone for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, rather than saying, well, should this population be able to vote, people with felony convictions? It would say, well, can we really take away the right to vote from people because they have a felony conviction? And that's a pretty different question to be asking. But I think it's important to remember that people being denied access to the polls is obviously unacceptable. But a lot of people, when you talk about the voter turnout rates in the United States and why they're so low, a lot of people don't vote because they say, I have no idea who the candidates are, suggesting that maybe the candidates aren't actually reaching out to them, aren't seeking their votes, maybe because they aren't in a competitive election, that sort of thing. Or they say, the candidates don't speak to my issues, which again goes back to that question of representation that I was talking about before. So it's really important that we both protect the right of people to be able to, fill out their ballots and put it in the box, and also make sure that that isn't just putting a piece of paper in a box. It's conveying real political power. And that's the sort of thing that ranked choice voting can help to convey.
Well, we had a guest on talking about what she calls unequal and unrepresented, different volumes of political speech in America, and that money seems to dwarf and impact so much of the process, so that, yes, it's all one man, one vote, one woman, one vote, but there's a lot of political speech that's louder than others.
Yes, when it comes to the question of money in politics, it can serve as a sort of a gatekeeper role, right? In order to be a viable candidate, you have to be able to raise certain amounts of money. That is absolutely an important issue. It's worth noting that Maine also has a public financing system. For example, they provide a certain amount of money to candidates who choose to participate, and those candidates then don't do any fundraising. They operate on those funds alone. That kind of system tends to draw in a lot of independent and third-party voices. It may be part of the story for why Maine has had so many strong independent and third-party candidates. And when you have that sort of thing, you start needing reforms like ranked choice voting. So these things all operate in a sort of ecosystem together. Money does not so much determine outcomes, though. It does help to, it sort of skews the candidate pool. But when we analyze, for example, for Congress, how much money plays a role, we see that the partisanship of the district tends to overwhelm the influence of money. So money can move the dial a few points. It can take a 60% Democratic district to a 65% Democratic district, or to a 55% Democratic district, but it can't move a 60% Democratic district all the way to a 55% Republican district, right? And so it's really important that we look at issues that relate to the lack of competition, the lack of voter choice that people have, in addition to the corrupting influence.
And I do want to talk about that, but before we do, because you came out with something, FairVote did, about the 2020 elections that I found very interesting, particularly given what happened in 2018. But I do want to ask you about other reforms that we have seen implemented across the country, not uniformly, but early voting, same-day registration, mail-in voting. Which of those is having the greatest impact, and which do you think will be almost uniformly adopted if we had the same conversation 4 to 6 years from now?
Yeah, voter turnout was remarkably high in 2018, and a lot of that certainly comes down to the interest that voters had, especially around the surprising result of the 2016 election. And the various, politics has just generally been a very volatile environment lately, and that does bring out a lot of interest in these sorts of things. States have been adopting more of these measures as a result, especially through the initiative process. So we saw a whole lot of pro-voter initiatives get on the ballot and pass in 2018. So we do seem to be moving in that direction. It's really pretty amazing. When FairVote started, the idea of, for example, automatic voter registration wasn't on the radar really at all. FairVote was one of the innovators in bringing that issue to light. We often take sort of an international perspective, and we noted that that is the common international way of doing voter registration in other countries, that rather than a voter needing to fill out a form and opt in to being allowed to vote, voters are allowed to vote by default. Eligible voters are allowed to vote by default. Only if they opt out do they get taken off of the voter rolls. That's the mindset behind automatic voter registration. And it does pair very well with a lot of the reforms that FairVote works on more directly now, like ranked choice voting and that sort of thing.
I'm so confused because when I did talk to a colleague of yours who wrote a book about what Operation Red Map was in 2010 with the census and gerrymandering, where basically the politicians select their voters before the voters select the politician. And the Republicans were masterful at controlling state legislatures and governorships, and they almost ensured that they would have control of the House of Representatives until at least the 2020 census. So I'm wondering what happened here in 2018.
Yeah, 2018 was a really remarkable year in terms of who voted, who came out to vote, and how they voted. So we do a project called Monopoly Politics every 2 years, where we make our projections for the next set of congressional elections that we expect to, who we expect to win and who we don't.
And by the way, that's my lead-in to your Monopoly Politics 2020 expectations, because who could have imagined that, again, with all the gerrymandering, where they set up Democratic districts to get 98% of the vote for someone in an urban area, and then moved all these suburban districts into a 52-48% construct, that this could turn. I mean, what happened here again?
Right, but in the lead up to the 2018 election, in our Monopoly Politics 2018 report, what we said is that given the underlying geography and the way that these district lines look, it will be extremely challenging for Democrats to win the House in 2018. They would need a really major Democratic wave year. By that we mean not only how many seats they would need to earn, but the percent of voters overall that would be trying to get a Democratic House, what we call the two-party split. And that's what we saw in 2018. A lot of people, when they talk about was this a blue wave, how strong of a Democratic year was it, they talk about the number of seats Democrats picked up. A better metric is what indicates how much voters wanted Democrats versus Republicans nationwide. And what we see when we do that is that it was about 54% of the country that wanted a Democratic House. Now, for reference, 2010, which was the strongest Republican wave year, was a little bit less than that. That was about a 53.8% Republican year. Democrats outperformed the biggest wave year that I really know about in any prior election, at least in in modern times. And the results of that were Democrats were running everywhere. They were able to acquire a lot of funding everywhere. Everyone knew it was going to be a heavily Democratic year, and so there was a lot of competition from that angle. And they won a lot of very surprising seats. Even some of the seats we thought for sure would be going to Republicans in 2018, Democrats were able to win. That said, we were still accurate in 97% of our projections. It's still the case that congressional districts are much too safe for one party or the other, much too lacking in competition. And that is looking like it's going to be true in 2020 as well. Democrats have an easier time now that they hold a majority of the incumbents. There's always an advantage to having the incumbency in any particular district. But we still see a House that could go back to the Republicans even in a year that favored Democrats.
But when you see Democrats winning in places like Kansas or Orange County, California, where they've always been Republican and suburban, I mean, something obviously happened here that turned off a lot of Republican voters to the Republican brand.
Yeah, it was a very heavily Democratic year, and you can see that when you look back at the things that happened over the course of the last 2 years. So since the 2016 election, there have been a lot of signs of energy on the Democratic side. If you look at every special election that happened since then, there was the election of Connor Lamb, there was the Alabama special election, a lot of really surprising results. demonstrating that Democrats were really energized after the 2016 elections and wanted to come out and vote when they had the opportunity. Not that Republicans weren't, but there wasn't nearly the same level of energy on the Republican side as there appears to have been on the Democratic side.
So how comfortable do you feel with your Monopoly Politics 2020, where you say expect non-competitive elections in more than 80% of congressional seats for the next election? And then you also highlight FairVote projects that if a slim majority of voters nationwide vote for Democrats in 2020, the Democrats will nonetheless lose the House. Now, this has got to be so hard to project, given that we don't know who's going to be at the top of the ticket.
So that's an interesting point. However, these projections are only in the very safest of districts. So we only make what we call our high confidence projections in a seat where the prior election results, which is all we look at. We only look at prior election results. We don't take into consideration things like how much candidates are spending or, like you say, who's even running. We nonetheless see that if we project a result for high enough for one of the two major parties, we've been right over 4 election cycles about 99% of the time. So we have a very high success rate, and 2018 was the most we have ever gotten wrong in terms of those high confidence projections. It was a very unusual year, and so it's not surprising that it set the record for the most we've ever gotten wrong, but we still had 97% of them right. So 367 out of the 379 projections that we made proved accurate. So we still feel very confident in saying that these seats that we're identifying, the just over 80% of them, are very likely to go exactly the way that we're projecting. 99% accurate, so not 100%, but very, very, very confident.
So right now you say those include 168 for the Democrats and 190 for the Republicans, though these may change slightly as the 2018 election results are finalized, and the battle for the House will be fought over the remaining 77 seats. Who controls those seats as a result of the 2018 election?
Yeah, those are the seats that are now disproportionately held by Democrats because 2018 was such a big wave year. And that means a couple of things. It means that Democrats get the incumbency advantage in those districts, which is going to help them out a lot. But it also means they're playing defensive. So we're going to see a lot of Democrats seeking re-election in districts that voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton. How those Democrats are going to campaign is going to be an interesting question. Can they maintain the kind of momentum from 2018 that they had in 2020? Will Democrats be able to hold those seats? Probably they'll be able to hold some of them. Probably they'll lose some of them. I wouldn't, because 2018 was so unusual, I would expect 2020 to be a little closer to 50-50, regression to the mean if nothing else. And so I would expect Democrats to lose some of those seats, and the question will be, can they maintain enough of their momentum to keep enough of them to keep the House? So it's possible where, things are looking much better for the Democrats in 2020 than they were in 2018, but it's still the case that those district lines systematically favor Republicans over Democrats, and so it's still the case that Democrats need to get a strong majority of the nationwide vote to hold their majority. If they just get a decent majority of the nationwide vote, Republicans will take it back from them. That's the nature of the system we have. Not every vote is treated equally.
In closing, the issue of voter suppression. We hear a lot about it. We did in Georgia. And then, of course, lots of issues that were raised about Florida. Once again, the president coming on saying that people are wearing disguises and going back and forth and so forth. Just to put you on the record in fairvote.org about this issue, of what's going on out there, suppression versus fraud. Help us to understand what you see as fair vote.
There's near consensus among the people that study the issue that the kind of voter fraud that gets raised again and again by pundits and so on is not really a serious problem in elections. There's some number of arrests per election cycle of people who frequently by accident voted when they thought they were eligible but weren't, and that might include people with felony convictions who thought their rights were restored. It might include people who weren't citizens but were permanent residents and thought they had the right to vote but didn't. What we don't see are coordinated efforts to get a bunch of people to illegally vote for one particular candidate over another particular candidate. That does not seem to be a problem in United States elections. And there are lots of problems in United States elections. And election administrators are working to resolve those problems in a whole number of ways. Working to get better communication across states, to clean up the voter registration rolls, working to make sure that people can access the polls when they need to, that they don't wind up getting directed to the wrong polling place. Many of those sorts of problems, the sort of more mundane problems, are really the ones that should be focused on. The issue of widespread systematic voter fraud, on the other hand, is something of a boogeyman that's brought up, sometimes, unfortunately, in a way that delegitimizes elections, which is a real problem. We need to come to a place where we understand that our elections are elections where people are voting, their votes are being counted, and that the system itself absolutely is skewing it in ways that deserve to be corrected. But that there isn't some nefarious scheme behind it all.
And when we did read about Brian Kemp and what he was doing as Secretary of the State in Georgia and running as governor, did you have concerns, or did FairVote have concerns about voter suppression in that case?
We were not active in that case specifically. I think that in 2018, we were particularly wrapped up with the ranked choice voting work, especially with Maine voting for the first time. There was also a vote in Memphis to retain ranked choice voting, so we were interested in that. What I can say is that 2018 had immensely high voter turnout. People seem to face those challenges well. The people that are looking into any sorts of problems that went on, whether intentional or not, are doing an excellent job of doing that. But we just want to make sure that when people vote, their votes really do have political power, that it is something where they have real choices, or their choices matter, and we wind up with a fair outcome at the end of the day.
Drew Penrose, thank you so much for coming by today. FairVote.org, if you're looking for where our electoral process is moving, they're often moving that process along. And we thank you so much for coming by today once again on America Trends.
All right, thank you.